And greetings to you, thrill seekers, conversationalists, and music lovers all across the bountiful and optimistic fruited plain. It's the Rush Limbaugh program here on the Excellence in Broadcasting Network. We come to you with great pride today, great thrill to be with you, especially today, from the EIB Southern Command and the Limbaugh Institute for Advanced Conservative Studies, which we will be studying quite a lot today. Happy to have you with us. The telephone number for your calls and comments when they begin is 800-282-2882. The email address is rush@eibnet.com. And as always, a special welcome to those of you watching on the Ditto Cam today. It'll be up for the entire 3 hours. It's a subscriber service at rushlimbaugh.com. We call the subscriber service Rush 24/7. You know, they say, ladies and gentlemen, that when someone who has lived just a wonderful life, a full life, and every way, that sadness upon that person's death is not inappropriate, but it's not necessary. Yet, I have to tell you, I'm sad today. Some of you have written over the weekend and speculated as to what was not wrong with me, but why I was sort of subdued on Friday. I had received information on Friday that this was coming, and this has affected me in ways that I did not expect. President Reagan has basically been out of the public eye for at least 10 years, and everyone knew this day was coming. Saturday's day was coming, but nevertheless, since Saturday afternoon at 4 o'clock Eastern Time, I have felt like a part of me died as well. But I know that Ronald Reagan lives on in my heart, as he will live on in all of your hearts as well. I never met Reagan, but it wasn't necessary to have met him in order to love him, which I do. And that's as great a measure of greatness as I know. You know, and people say, I've said it, I've reminded you of it many times here, it's said that greatness doesn't need to be explained. And that's true for those people who were paying attention at the time. But sadly, most people's historical perspective traces back only to the day they were born. If you couple that fact with the realization that history education in this country, the public school system, is woefully inept, then by that, I mean I have heard from people over the weekend whose 17 and 18-year-old kids have no idea who Ronald Reagan is. They know all about the Vietnam War, and they know all about some of the horrible history involving America since, but they don't know anything about Reagan. They've not been taught much about Reagan at all. This is a huge eye-opener for them. They are asking their parents, why is everybody going nuts over this guy? Millions of Americans also under the age of 30 have no concrete memory of Ronald Reagan's presidency, and yet we are all, including them, touched by his greatness. So I'd like to take a moment here to explain to those of you who have no direct relationship with Ronald Reagan, you weren't old enough or even born during his presidency to have understood it or to have known how you have been affected by it, because the simple fact is that now in death, Ronald Reagan once again defines the utter beauty and blessing that is America and reminds us all of our destiny. You know, Reagan's greatness is not about a single speech or a single phrase in a speech or a single memory. Ronald Reagan was great because he was a man. He was a great man, and he knew who he was. He was comfortable in his skin. He was optimistic and happy. He was infectious. He dared to embrace big ideas. He dared to do big things, to overcome huge obstacles in the midst of all kinds of experts telling him it couldn't be done, in the midst of all kinds of criticism, in the midst of all kinds of personal insults. I must tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I have been in awe this weekend, watching some of the coverage, listening to some of the people who I remember explicitly insulting this man every bit as much as they insult George W. Bush today, now sing his praises. And I look interestingly and curiously at the TV set when I see this, and I said, well, which is it then? Was he great? If he was great, he was great then. I've seen some of the most incredible testaments to his policies. And I've seen the usual digs. I mean, it's all out there, but you expect the digs in this current climate, and they're there. But the idea that people who did routinely do everything they could to diminish Ronald Reagan in the eyes of a nation who loved him, now the fact that they do not dare come forth and be honest at this point in time about their true beliefs and feelings of Ronald Reagan is another testament to his greatness. They don't dare, because they know the love this country has for Ronald Reagan. They know it would be suicide to practice their politics as usual during this period. Ronald Reagan was great because he never gave up on his country. And the reason he never gave up on his country, ladies and gentlemen, is because he never doubted for a moment any of us. He never doubted our wisdom. He never doubted our judgment. He never doubted our ability to do the right thing. He never doubted our ability to rise to necessary challenges. Ronald Reagan never doubted the people of this country at all. That made him a huge threat, because Reagan's enemies had no threat or no confidence and no faith in the American people. They still don't. Their view of the American people is one of incompetence, lack of judgment, inability, basic averageness. And of course, they must think that, for if they don't, there's no reason for them. You know, some people forget that in the late 70s and the early 80s, the Washington establishment, which is what Reagan would later call the iron triangle of the liberal media, liberal special interest groups, and the massive bureaucracy. Some forget that in the late 70s and early 80s, the Washington establishment was talking of America's inevitable decline. Jimmy Carter's presidency was looked at by the American left as, well, gee, if our best and brightest can't make anything out of this, maybe there's something wrong with this. Never thought there was anything wrong with them. Never thought there was anything wrong with their ideas. Never thought there was anything wrong with their president. And so rather than question their own role in bringing the nation to the point it was in 1979 and 80, the worst economy since the Great Depression, Soviet Union on the march throughout the world, the elites of liberalism questioned the fortitude of the American people. Yes, my friends, it was, after all, the establishment's failed policies and worldview that had led the nation into economic and international decline. It wasn't the people, and Reagan knew it. After Jimmy Carter, the establishment, the elites, were questioning whether the presidency itself, I wonder how many people remember this, the late 70s, early 80s, the Washington and New York elites were themselves questioning whether the presidency itself could survive as then structured, whether it was a job too big for any one man. You remember this? Some people wondered whether the Constitution should be changed to provide for a single 6-year term rather than requiring a president to run for re-election. Along came Ronald Reagan, and there's no doom and gloom in Ronald Reagan. He's the optimist, eternally so, shining city on a hill. He would have none of this doom and gloom. He rejected Washington elitism, and he had since 1964 and before. Talk about core values. Talk about sticking to them. He rejected Washington elitism and connected directly with the American people who adored him. He didn't need the press. He didn't need the press to spin what he was or what he said. He had the ability to connect individually with each American who saw him. That is an incredible, I don't even want to say talent, it's a characteristic that so few Americans have, so few people have, that he was able to do it. He brought confidence, he brought vigor, and he brought humility to the presidency, which had been missing for years. And this profoundly upset his political and media adversaries to no end, and Reagan enjoyed that. Ronald Reagan rejected socialism. He rejected big government. He insisted on returning as much government back to the people as was possible. He cut taxes so deeply that even some on his own staff became disbelievers and wrote books about it. They were wrong. He was right. Our lives today are a testament to how right Ronald Reagan was. Reagan created the greatest economic expansion in American history, and certainly since World War II. He wasn't always successful in cutting government programs, but he tried. He slowed the growth of domestic spending by vetoing spending bills and by shutting down the federal bureaucracy. But in the end, in our constitutional system, it's Congress that controls the purse strings, and they made deals with him they didn't keep. But he tried. In fact, Ronald Reagan proved something that to this day, economists, elite economists, do not believe. Ronald Reagan lowered inflation during the midst of one of the most unbridled economies and its growth period in history. No economist thought that possible. But he did. He brought inflation down to 4.8% from its double-digit figure when he took office. And significantly, unlike Franklin Roosevelt, and this is key, Roosevelt turned to government in a failed effort to revive the American economy. The New Deal did not revive the American economy. World War II did. The New Deal just revived government. Ronald Reagan, instead of turning to government to revive a failed American economy, turned to us, the American people. He worked to unleash our ingenuity, our entrepreneurialism, our enterprise, and productivity. You've heard it said all weekend that Reagan made people feel good about themselves. That's true. He made people feel good about the military. That's true. He made people feel good about their country. Yeah, he did all of that. No mean feat. And for those of you who weren't around or paying attention in 1979 and 1980, throughout actually 1984, huge recession in 81 and 82. For those of you who weren't around, you have no idea. Nothing since has happened quite like it. Those of you who came of age during the campaign of 1992 and you listened to Bill and Hillary Clinton talk about the 80s as the worst economy in the last 50 years, it was a lie. The American people were sympathetic to it because there was a small little recession occurring in 1990 and 91 into the 92 campaign. But it was nothing compared to what Ronald Reagan inherited and how Ronald Reagan fixed it. This has been a staple of this program since its inception in 1988. Actually, 84 in Sacramento, my adopted hometown. And that is that you are the ones who make this country great. You are the ones who make this country happen. You are the ones who create this economy. You are the people who determine the destiny of this country, not our leaders. Our leaders, if they're good, get us to do things that may be tough, maybe things we don't want to do at the time, maybe endure things we would rather not. But leaders get obstacles out of our way. Leaders do show us the way, and I'm not trying to diminish Reagan with this. I'm trying to celebrate Reagan. Reagan knew, because of his unbridled love for the American people, coupled with our God-given freedom, our natural yearning to be free, Reagan knew that all he had to do was unleash that, and it was Katie bar the doors. And he was right. He was right then. He is right today. He will be right for as long as there is America. Those who choose to follow in his footsteps will also be right. Those who choose to follow in his footsteps will experience the optimism and the good cheer and the love of country that he always had. There are many who will carry on in his tradition. I'm honored to be one of them. I wouldn't be sitting here were it not for Ronald Reagan, and I never met him. Must take a break. There's much more to go. The EIB Network and Rush Limbaugh back after this. Stay with us.
The most trusted name in talk radio, Rush Limbaugh, on the EIB Network.
Welcome back. Rush Limbaugh, the Excellence in Broadcasting Network. And our tribute to Ronald Reagan continues. You know, Ronald Reagan not only rejected socialism and big government, but he also rejected, as you know, communism. I was rejected. He defeated it ultimately, and I'm getting to that point. But it was, Reagan did not, so many elites, so many of the left in Reagan's era said then what's being said today about militant Islam and what Chamberlain said about Nazism. Well, it's there. We can't do anything about it. We just got to try to manage it. We have to try to get along with it. We have to try to make sure that we don't destroy each other. And Reagan figuratively scratched his head and said, what's that? Get along with this? Look at what they're doing to people. Look at what they're doing to their people. Get along with this? They're on the march. Their stated objectives were as plain as day. Those of you who weren't around during all of this, the era of the Cold War and Soviet expansionism, it is imperative you find out. It is imperative you understand what this man did. It is imperative you understand how he did it. It's not just that he did it without firing a shot. He did it because he refused to accept it, all alone amongst those at his leadership level. So he set us out on a course to win, not manage, the Cold War. And I consider that to be the final battle of the Second World War. He freed tens of millions of people who had been imprisoned behind the Iron Curtain for nearly 5 decades. Those people survive Ronald Reagan today. In his obituary, they should be mentioned as survivors. And I notice some liberal commentators now contend that the fall of the Soviet Union was inevitable, just as they once considered the decline of American greatness inevitable. They still don't get it, and they never will. Mid-90s, I attended a lecture given by Lady Margaret Thatcher at the Waldorf in New York. She made a point of saying that it was Reagan, not Gorbachev, who brought down the Soviet Union, primarily by proposing SDI. It was at that moment that Gorbachev knew it was over because he knew we Americans could do SDI, and his country couldn't. Later, I had the good fortune to become close friends with Lady Thatcher, and I often reminded her of that lecture and her point, and she commanded me, which is how she speaks, she commanded me to never allow people to think otherwise, never allow people to think that it was anyone other than Ronald Reagan and the spirit of America and its goodness and its faith in God that defeated the Soviet Union. I remember I went to a dinner at a private home in Manhattan. I was asked to give the toast. It was a dinner in honor of Lady Thatcher. The guests were the usual Manhattan elites, many media people, network presidents. After Lady Thatcher's remarks, when the hostess asked for questions, there were none. So I rose. I asked her who won the Cold War. She gave the same answer in her lecture to the dinner guests. At this dinner, they sat in stone silence. They knew it. They didn't want to hear it. I wish I had had a camera so you would know who. I'm not going to say who was at this dinner, but I wish you could have seen their faces when she said it.
Rush Limbaugh.
On the cutting edge of societal evolution. Honored to be here today, having more fun than a human being should be allowed to have. Let me set the stage for you at this Manhattan dinner party. It doesn't matter who it is because you don't need to know the names to know the type of people. Network presidents, programmers, media elites. It was a media elite dinner, and I was there. And the reason I was there is because of all the people invited, I was the one qualified to offer the official toast to Lady Margaret Thatcher. And so I did. And Lady Thatcher, as was her, and this is a dinner in her honor at this private home in Manhattan, after dinner, the hostess asked her for some remarks. She made some brief remarks for her, brief 10, 20 minutes. After they were over, the hostess opened it up for questions, and there wasn't a person, there must be about 25 people, 25 or 30, not one person stood, not one person raised their hand, not one person had a question. And during her remarks, Lady Thatcher had not touched on the Cold War, but I had remembered being profoundly affected by her admission at this lecture that I attended with Justice Kennedy. In fact, I was his guest at the Waldorf. And So I rose and I said, Lady Thatcher, could you explain, there's a lot of controversy being waged in the country right now about what brought about the end of the Soviet Union. Many people think that it would not have happened were it not for Gorbachev. Gorbachev was a new leader, perestroika, glasnost. You were there. You were part of it. What's your view? She got stern as she could be at the notion that Gorbachev had anything substantively to do with it. She stood up and she just went down the list of what it was and why it happened. And again, she focused on the fact that it was because Reagan had the audacity, Reagan had the fortitude to propose SDI. At the time, again, and a lot of what I'm saying today, most of you in this audience have heard it, but I'm hoping to reach people who have no concrete direct memory or relationship with President Reagan because of your age or because you weren't paying attention. But SDI was regarded much as the whole war in Iraq is today. SDI was treated as a joke. SDI was dangerous. SDI was going to blow up the world. SDI was impossible. SDI is typical liberalism. Greatness couldn't be done. Greatness can't happen. This is only going to kill us all. This is just the meanderings of a B actor. You people have forgotten how absolutely mean-spirited the critics of Reagan were about him and to him personally. He never flinched. He never cared. He smiled at it. But when she stood up and went through this list of things and made the point that it was at that moment Mikhail Gorbachev realized it was over because he couldn't keep up. His country couldn't do it, and he knew Americans could create SDI. In fact, I've got a story. There's an AP story somewhere in the stack quoting Gennady Gasimov, who was one of the spokesmen back then, saying this very thing, if you don't believe me, and if you don't believe Lady Thatcher. And when she stood up and gave this answer, there was no applause, there was no reaction. The guests at this dinner sat stone-faced because they knew it, but they didn't want to hear it. You know, Reagan did not hasten the Soviet collapse. He was responsible for it. And he was practically alone in his confidence that Soviet communism would fail. And his reason for believing it would fail was simple, folks. And it's a reason that is eternal. He knew the Soviet Union would eventually collapse of its own immorality if pushed in the right places. So he pushed. Reagan was also concerned about an all-powerful judiciary, undermining the will of the people, and attempted to do something about that. He spent 8 years appointing people to the federal bench who were committed to interpreting the Constitution, not rewriting it. One of the most brilliant minds on the court today, Antonin Scalia, is a Reagan appointee. Reagan is the one who elevated Rehnquist to Chief Justice. The liberals are still trying to reverse this impact of Reagan. They're still trying to reverse everything he did. That's what the Clinton presidency was about. It's what the Clinton campaign of '92 was about, was reversing the 80s. The whole reason for existence of liberalism, folks, in recent years has been to wipe out the memory of the 80s and rewrite it as something it wasn't. Decade of greed, decade of selfishness. You know, lest we forget, Reagan was called many things by those who resented him. He was called a cowboy. Does that sound familiar? He was called a dunce. Does that sound familiar? What have I always told you about the liberal playbook never changes? There are no new pages in it. He was called a danger. That sound familiar? He was going to blow up the world. Washington elites described his 49-state landslide in 1984 as a triumph of greed and selfishness. I had to laugh over the weekend. 49-state landslide. Ronald Reagan received more popular votes than any president in history in 1984, and still there are pieces in the media this weekend. Could Reagan beat Clinton? Clinton never got 50% of the vote. It wouldn't be a contest. You know, there was one debate in the 1980 presidential campaign, one debate very near the election. And the Carter people thought that they were going to clean the clock with Ronald Reagan. They thought Reagan was a dunce and an idiot, and we all know what happened. You talk about deer in the headlight eyes, that was Jimmy Carter in that whole debate. Ronald Reagan debated Bobby Kennedy in the 1960s. You will not believe the story of this. I forget what the subject matter was, but the Kennedy people couldn't wait for this. You know, Reagan was ascending after his Goldwater speech in '64. And the Kennedy crowd thought, we're going to wipe the stage with this guy. This guy's nothing. The typical way that liberals look at conservatives, and particularly conservative leaders. When it was over, Bobby Kennedy called Pierre Salinger in Paris and said, "Don't you ever put me with this guy again. It's impossible." Reagan was real. He just connected one-on-one with everybody. He had no ego. None. He was totally comfortable with who he was. He liked who he was, and he liked everybody else. As I said, Reagan's entire presidency became known as the decade of greed by Democrats who today claim to praise and venerate him. And in fact, I will never forget after the election of 1984, I was in California. The Democrats, Alan Cranston was running around all over the state trying to tell old people that Reagan's reelection would cause them to lose their homes and their health care. Ever heard of that? Does that sound familiar? 20 years ago. David Broder, I'm pretty sure, his first column in the Washington Post after Reagan's reelection called it a triumph of greed and selfishness over citizenship. Meaning the 49-state landslide were some people who wanted theirs, who wanted their tax cut, and to hell with the poor and disadvantaged and what have you. I think Broder also wrote, what was Reagan was 69 when he was first. Broder wrote, he's too old to be in touch with anything. I haven't seen what Broder has said this weekend, but he was just an example. They were all saying things like this because they hated Ronald Reagan, and don't let anybody tell you differently. They feared him, which was the reason for their hate. They could not outflank him. They couldn't relate to people as he could, and they were the people who had the common touch, they told us. They were the people who had the ability to understand what life was like for the average guy, and here's Ronald Reagan running circles around them. Of course they didn't like him. He posed a great threat. Reagan was accused of sexism. He was accused of racism. He was accused of heartlessness. They said he was responsible for homelessness and AIDS. They said he was going to start World War III and destroy the social safety net, including Social Security, the school lunch program. Sound familiar? See how left never changes? But Reagan was none of those things and did none of those things. He was wiser, he was smarter, and bigger than his detractors. Thankfully, he outwitted them all, and for one primary reason. He had the truth on his side. He knew that it was us that would make all this happen, the American people. And he told us that repeatedly. Everybody loves hearing what's expected of them. Everybody loves, everybody reacts. Most people react to great expectations laid before them. And that's what Reagan did. Reagan elevated our own expectations of ourselves and of our country, and we rose to the challenge. He knew America and the American people better than anyone, especially those who sought to govern from inside the Beltway. I'll never forget, it was, I think, 1990, and I was at 21 Club in New York for dinner with some friends. I had been doing this show for 2 years. Now, I want to over-personalize this, but Ronald Reagan believed things happen for a reason. So he wasn't worried about little details and the ups and downs of things because he looked the long view, saw the far-off distance, and just had faith that it was going to be okay, as long as America remained America. Now, 2 years into this program, and I'm being criticized and having things said about me that have never been said about me before, and I don't know how to deal with it. I'm getting advice from people. Should I respond to this stuff, or should I ignore it? People say, well, if you respond to it, you're sort of validating it. You're letting them know it bothers you. Just blow it off. Don't react to it. I said, yeah, but then people are going to think it's true if I don't respond to it. So this was one of the early frustrations that I experienced during this program. people saying things about you that aren't true, the instinct is to fix it and change the record. But I never knew what to do. I mean, for those 2 years, there was nobody who could tell me what to do. I was with no one who had been through it, and I really had no instinct myself what to do. One night I'm at dinner at 21, and I had to go to the bathrooms. I walked into the restroom. The restroom attendant in there recognized me and came up, shook his hand. Shook my hand. He was just ebullient. He knew who I was. He started talking to me about the one time he met President Reagan. And he just was as effusive, full of love and excitement, exuberance as anybody I can recall. Just happy to be telling me this. And after he went through describing what his meeting with Reagan was like, and it had been fairly recently, he looked at me, he cocked his head, his eyes got wide, and he said, "You know, Mr. Limbaugh, he never got mad at him. He never got mad at him once. He just laughed at him." And I said, bingo. There's my answer. In the restroom at the 21 Club from an attendant whose biggest thrill in life was having met Ronald Reagan. That man is a preacher today, that attendant. We'll be back and continue in just a second. Stay with us. Don't go away.
This Father's Day, thrill your dad with his own membership to Rush 24/7. Complete election news and analysis. Plus, round-the-clock access to El Rush Bowl. And a free bonus gift. Available only at RushLimbaugh.com. You're listening to the EIB Network.
America's truth detector and doctor of democracy, Rush Limbaugh, continuing now with a tribute to Ronald Reagan. Ladies and gentlemen, another thing it's important to remember. It wasn't just Democrats and liberals who criticized Ronald Reagan after he left office. Republicans in Washington, I will never forget this, Republicans in Washington also were weak in defending Reagan's policies after he left office. They were afraid to defend the tax cuts of the 1980s. They were afraid to defend the charge that the 80s was a decade of greed and selfishness. They were afraid to tell the truth of why deficits grew. The Clintons called the 80s the worst economy in the last 50 years in 1992, and many Republicans in Washington wouldn't stop and step up to remind people of the truth. Well, I did. I remember sitting here in the early years of this program aghast that members of Ronald Reagan's own party in Washington didn't have, and it wasn't all, but didn't have the guts and the courage to stand up and defend him, particularly when it came to tax cuts and foreign policy, the two things that he was most profound on. Throughout the early years of this program, it was an objective of mine to keep the Reagan legacy alive. I was a product of it. It's not even enough to say I believed it. I felt like I was part of it, that I would not have had the life I have were it not for Reagan. I understood it, and I believed in it, and I thought all Republicans did too. What I learned later was that there were factions in the Republican Party, the old country club blue blood set. They never liked Reagan because he displaced them too. And so when he was gone, it was their turn to try to reassert themselves in control of the party. Well, that's what happened in the party, but this program is not the Republican Party. This program is conservatism and the Reagan legacy. You know, I wonder what Reagan would say to us about this new war, this war on terrorism, liberation of Iraq. So I went to his Point du Hoc speech back in 1984, D-Day. He said it was the deep knowledge, and pray God we've not lost it, that there is a profound moral difference between the use of force for liberation and the use of force for conquest. He said to the surviving Rangers who scaled the cliffs at Point du Hoc on D-Day, "You were here to liberate, not to conquer, and so you and those others did not doubt your cause, and you were right not to doubt. We in America have learned bitter lessons from 2 world wars. It is better to be here, ready to protect the peace, than to take blind shelter across the sea, rushing to respond only after freedom is lost. We've learned that isolationism never was, never will be an acceptable response to tyrannical governments with an expansionist intent. But we try always to be prepared for peace, prepared to deter aggression, prepared to negotiate the reduction of arms. And yes, prepared to reach out again in the spirit of reconciliation. Reagan was right, just as George W. Bush is today. And I really believe that if Reagan had been able, he would have put his hand on Bush's shoulder and said to him, "Stay the course, George." I really believe that. As I said at the beginning of this hour, and I've been fighting it because this is not what Reagan was about, but since Saturday afternoon at 4 o'clock Eastern Time, I have honestly felt like a part of me died as well. Even though I knew it was coming, we all knew it was coming, I was surprised at how deeply the act of his passing had on me, despite knowing it was coming. And I was comforted all the remainder of the weekend by the reality and the realization that I know that Ronald Reagan lives on in my heart, always will, and in all of yours. I never met him. Wasn't necessary. It was not necessary to have met Ronald Reagan in order to love him, as I do. And that is as good a measure of greatness, which does not need to be explained, as I know. So God bless Ronald Reagan, and as he never failed to say, God bless America. Be back right after this. Stay with us.
We're always ready, so bring it on. Rush on the EIB Network.
Is now over. If I may refer to it as this, the funniest news story today about the death of Ronald Reagan happens to fall predictably and be published predictably in the New York Times. It's by Adam Nagorny, Reagan legacy looming large over campaign. They are worried at the New York Times that the death of Ronald Reagan will propel George W. Bush, because if anybody in this campaign is an heir to Ronald Reagan, it's George W. Bush. The second funniest thing is that John Kerry supposedly suspended his candidacy. He hasn't. Just as I've always told you, the less he speaks, the more coverage he gets. He's getting more coverage for suspending his candidacy than for anything he said during his candidacy. We'll be back. Greetings to you, thrill seekers. Welcome back. It's the award-winning, thrill-packed, ever-exciting, growing by leaps and bounds Rush Limbaugh program on the one and only Excellence in Broadcasting Network. And specifically today, we come to you from the Limbaugh Institute for Advanced Conservative Studies. You're going to be getting your phone calls because I know that a lot of you would like to share some of the thoughts and feelings that you have about Ronald Reagan and your experiences with him. So the number is 800-282-2882. We're going to get to phone calls here in just a second. If you want to go email, you may do that too. rush@eibnet.com is the email address. And by popular demand, ladies and gentlemen, we are at this moment feverishly cleaning up the transcript of the first hour, and we're going to post it on the website. We're not going to wait till we update the site, which is usually around 6 or 6:30 each evening. When we update it to reflect the contents of that day's program. We're going to put that up first hour as soon as we get it cleaned up. Transcripts are always raw. The transcriber sometimes doesn't hear something, doesn't get it entered right. Nothing against transcribe. I mean, when I get going, it's tough to follow me. As soon as it gets cleaned up, we're going to put it up there, and you'll be able to see it. I have, so many Reagan stories come to mind, but I just want to tell you one. It's hard to pick one. After that, it's one thing to do what we're all doing today, and that's remember back and to reflect. But this man's life was so important. This man's life was so moving and so profound that I think it would be worth some time to look into the future and begin to ask ourselves how we can honor the memory of Ronald Reagan in the future. And not with memorials. There are people who will take care of that. Not with Mount Rushmore, not with the airport. That's all going to be done. I'm talking about what we as a nation can do. Well, I think we have to do, in fact, in order to honor Reagan's memory. First, this story, and I don't know why this one is the first one that comes to mind, but it just touches me and it makes me laugh. It goes back when Reagan was governor of California back in the 60s. And, of course, the free speech movement was raging, and the college protesters are going bonkers. And it was the Vietnam era, and I forget what it was that had motivated and inspired the protesters on this particular day. But they stormed the Capitol. They stormed Reagan's office in Sacramento, or where he might have been in Berkeley somewhere. They demanded to see him, and they weren't going to surrender what they had taken over until he saw them. And they demanded. They were just vicious as they could be. They were shouting, and the press was all there. But Reagan finally relented. And he let a group of these student leaders come into his office. And one of the student leaders just started pointing a finger at him and called, "You're an old fogey. You can't tell us how to live. You can't tell us about our future. You can't tell us what's going to happen to us because you're too old. You don't have any of the things. You didn't have any of the things that we've got now. You didn't know what phones were like. You didn't know what automobile travel was. You didn't know what traveling by air. You didn't know what instant communications are." And this is the 60s, and but they just started listing all of these things that he was unable to relate to them about. And who was he to sit here and make policy for them? So he listened patiently as they shouted and screamed at him. And when they were finished, he looked at him, he said, "Well, you're right. We didn't have any of those things. We had to invent them for you." Dead silence. The message was, get the hell out of my office and get about your lives. But it was a very rebellious period, as college years can be, although they're marked by different kinds of rebellion lately. All right, a question comes to mind. How can we honor the memory of Ronald Reagan? And it seems to me that the memory of Ronald Reagan and his death, coupled, of course, with his life, can serve to be a renewed call to greatness. And I think there's no greater time for this nation to hear and to feel a new call for greatness. Now, for those of you who think politics has never been more mean-spirited, never been more divisive, for those of you who think politics is worse than it's ever been, and that partisanship is worse than it's ever been, and the country is more divided than it's ever been, you have forgotten the 80s. The divisions in the 80s were just as profound as they are today. The hatred for a sitting president was just as profound then as it is today. The catcalls and the criticisms and the accusations that George Bush hears, Ronald Reagan heard them all. The one thing that was different is that Reagan had multiple state landslide victories propelling him, and he had thus a mandate. He had his eternal optimism and confidence in his faith in God, all of which George W. Bush possesses, it seems to me. Other than that electoral landslide, there's also something else, and this is I'm going to say this again. Back when Reagan was president, there was no Rush Limbaugh show. There was no Fox News. There was no meaningful conservative media at all. It was the three networks, the Washington Post, the New York Times, Newsweek, Time Magazine, the local newspapers in big cities, and CNN. They ruled the roost. Don't believe what you're seeing on TV this weekend about how much love and respect there was for Ronald Reagan. There was none. They wanted to impeach Reagan, and they tried with the Iran-Contra affair. They wanted to impeach him. It was vicious back then. A testament to the man is how he overcame it with no media friends, or very few. The media he had that was friendly was local. But national media still ran the show, ruled the roost, had their monopoly back then. And they were all aligned against Reagan. There were exceptions, of course, George Will, columnists, but I'm talking about the mainstream partisan media back then was oppressive. Yet he overcame it. So, again, and he overcame it with the force of his personality, but it can be done, is the point. A common theme I try to constantly remind all of you of here on this program. So, yeah, we have divisions, and those who say we can't be great, well, we were great in the 80s with all these divisions. We were great in the 80s with all this acrimony, and there was acrimony. There was real dislike. I'll go so far as to say hatred for Reagan. And yet, it was one of the greatest periods. They've tried to rewrite how great it was to make it seem pitiful and poorly and unhappy and miserable, but it wasn't. And they are going to fail, those who are trying to rewrite the decade of the 80s and the Reagan presidency. They're going to fail because there are too many now with the power to stop them. But if we could be great then, coming out of a malaise of the Jimmy Carter presidency with double-digit inflation, double-digit unemployment, it was so bad we created a misery index as a means of calculating it. We had gasoline lines. We had home mortgage interest rates. What were they, at 12 or 13%? It was unbelievable. Imagine that today. What's your mortgage today? 6%, 7%, if that? Inflation, double digit. Reagan brought inflation down while growing the economy. The economists today still don't believe it's possible. One of the tools was the recession of 81, 82, but that's for another time. So, honoring the memory of President Reagan to me means being great as a nation, being great individually, doing what he always knew we could do, be the best we can. If obstacles in our way, get them out. Don't complain, don't whine. Obstacles happen, work around them, go over them, or sweep them out of the way. Just do it. We're Americans, the greatest nation on earth. We're human beings like everybody else on earth. Doesn't mean we're better human beings. This is key. Doesn't mean we're better human beings than anybody else. Reagan never said it. He never meant it. We are Americans because of our freedom. And Ronald Reagan understood that it was God-given and it was a natural part of our creation. And this is the one lone outpost on the face of the earth where it has a chance, the freedom, to run unbridled. And it is freedom that allows people to do whatever, to be the best, to be the worst, to be whatever they wish to be. Most of the people of the world have never had freedom, nor anywhere near the kind that we enjoy. Those born here take it for granted. Some don't even think it's worth fighting for, because they don't think they'll ever lose it, because to them it's just what's natural. It's the easiest thing in the world to lose, because the natural tendency of men, human beings, is to dominate, control, and rule others. We had founding fathers who understood this, set up a constitutional, limited republic that makes it as tough for a dictatorship to form as possible. It's why the Constitution must always be given fealty. It's why we must always teach it, never forget it, learn it, live it, and understand it. Well, Reagan instinctively knew all of this. It wasn't that we were better human beings. It was that we had the full blessings of God. Other human beings on the planet do not and did not. How do we honor this? Well, the first thing we do is fight to keep it. First thing we do is fight to maintain it and understand how precious it is. Second thing we do is to ensure that our circumstances are only as good as our willingness to help others achieve it as well. Will the baby boom generation, of which I am a semi-proud member, depending on who I'm talking to, will the baby boom generation ask itself how they can be the greatest generation? Right now, the greatest generation is said to be that of World War II. Nobody's going to say that about the baby boom generation, folks, anytime soon, unless we do something about it. Will the Gen X, the Gen Y generations, will they be the next greatest generation? Because I'm going to tell you something. We need one. We need a next greatest generation. I look at the people of the armed forces serving around the world and in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think, well, maybe we found it. It's not just defined by military, though. That's not it. It's who they are. It's why they're doing what they're doing. They're not being forced to, not being told to. They're volunteering to because for some reason, thank God, they understand what's at stake. Many in the baby boom generation, and I'm exempting, I don't want, somebody wrote me the other day, said, I'm a Vietnam vet and I really resent you. I'm not talking about Vietnam vets. The baby boom generation as a whole has never really had to face what's at stake. They might cite Vietnam, but they have a point to an extent, but Vietnam's a sore spot and unfortunately has served as the prism through which much of the baby boom generation looks at the future, which is a horrible thing. Got to wipe that out too. But nevertheless, thought the Gulf War had done it, but it didn't. It never will for the left because most of the left today came of age during the Vietnam War and they wish to validate their youth, say what they were doing then was important, so they continue to live it through every other war and every other social contract and every other experience they have as Americans. But it's time to get serious because we face great challenges. We always will face great challenges. Must have the courage to recognize that they're great challenges. The next thing we have to do is ask ourselves, how will we define our greatness? What will we do? What will we set out to accomplish that if we succeed will define our greatness? I'll ask you some questions about that when we come back. And again, remember, your phone calls are coming up. Sit tight. Don't go away. And we're back on the cutting edge of societal evolution. Rush Limbaugh, the happiest and most optimistic figure in American media today. Our telephone number, 800-282-2882. So a call to greatness. The death of Ronald Reagan, the reliving of his life, the remembrances of his presidency, the calling into public vogue again of the qualities and characteristics of his life. A call to greatness summons us again, I believe. We're in a moment of desperation, and as Reagan said in 1964, in that famous speech for Barry Goldwater, we are in a rendezvous with destiny, and it is up to us to meet our destiny. So how are we going to define our greatness in the future? Are we going to define our greatness because we fixed health care? Are we going to define our greatness because we raised the minimum wage whenever somebody said raise it? Are we going to define our greatness because we dealt with the horrible practice of outsourcing? Are we going to define our greatness because we put CEOs in jail? Are we going to define our greatness by electing people who assume the worst of us? Are we going to meet our greatness by having as leaders those who have no trust or faith in us? Will we be great because we have stopped or advanced gay marriage? Will we be great because we have passed a prescription drug entitlement? Will our kids think that we were great because of what we did with welfare? Will future generations of America proclaim American greatness and cite the American presidents who supported abortion? Are these the areas that we want to delve into so that we define our greatness in this manner? I think not. Because once again, ladies and gentlemen, we are faced with a challenge to our survival. And if our survival, as we've come to know it, doesn't continue, all the rest of these things I mentioned are academic. And engaging in solving all those problems will not secure our destiny unless we protect ourselves and rise to the challenge which faces us. The challenge is no different than the challenges we have faced throughout the 20th century. Nazism, communism, all of the isms, socialism, all of the tyrannical forms of government that we have faced are no different than militant Islamism. There are people, Jacques Chirac said it over the weekend, we got to find a way to get along and coexist with the militant Islamists. I reject that. He says it because it's a great religion. We can't go stamping out people's religions. I disagree. I don't think terrorism is a religion. I don't know of a religion on earth that teaches what militant Islam teaches. Al-Qaeda is not a religion. Saddam Hussein was not a religion. Zarqawi is not a religion. None of these disparate groups are. These are ideologies. These are ways of life. These are forms of government, forms of life that enslave people. They seek to enslave us or wipe us out. The question for our generation is, what do we want to do about this? Do we want to try to find a way to coexist with it and fool ourselves, say, well, it's a religion, we can't really do much about that? Or do we want to be honest with ourselves about the threat facing us, which is no longer a threat? 9/11 took the threat out of the equation. It's a reality. Or do we want to eliminate another evil for the free peoples of the world? We want to destroy it. We want to stamp it out. Do we want to be Jimmy Carter and Neville Chamberlain, or do we want to be Reagan and Churchill?
Rush Limbaugh. You're simply the best.
Could you give me the picture from New York? I'm asking them questions. Nobody is responding. So I want to see if they're actually there. Welcome back, folks. Rush Limbaugh and the EIB Network. We are at 800-282-2882 and the email address rush@eibnet.com. Last thing I want to mention, and we'll go by your phone calls here in just an El Jiffo. It was December 12th, 1992, my television show. And I received a surprise on that day. It was a picture of Ronald Reagan. It was the famous picture of that smile holding a glass of white wine. And there was a personal letter from him. I have this at home. It's framed. I'm still stunned. I'm still blown away by this. The letter says, "Thanks for all you're doing to promote Republican and conservative principles. Now that I've retired from active politics, I don't mind that you've become the number one voice for conservatism." Signed, Ronald Reagan. Can you imagine how I felt 4 years into this program? 1990, I was 41 years old. And there's a man who's a genuine hero. And this came in and I was bowled over by. There's a picture of it on the website at www.rushlimbaugh.com. We took a still from the video. I don't know if we can enlarge it much and maintain quality from what we have. I have not actually taken a picture of this. I guess I ought to, at some point, bring it in or have a picture taken so we can post it. In the meantime, let's go to the phone. What? I see they're there. I just was asking questions and they didn't answer them. So, Brett, can I have your attention for just a second? Hello. All right. Was it the American Spectator today? It's got that story about the flags at the DNC. This is... No, okay, well, I know the link. I can get it. I was just telling these guys in the break, and nobody believes me. I'm not sure I believe it either. But some staffers at the Democratic National Committee in Washington went out to lower the flags to half staff. And somebody inside the DNC saw them and went out there and said, "No, you're not lowering those flags here." And it's like the Washington Prowler segment or section of the American Spectator's website. Now, I can't believe that. Well, part of me, I guess I can, but I'm just stunned by it. I don't know if it's still the case. I don't know if cooler heads prevailed over the weekend and the flags are there now, half staff. But it was, at some point, it was the case. Nancy Pelosi, Miss America, delayed her announcement till late at night. on her thoughts of Reagan's passing. There's folks, don't believe all this love and adoration you're hearing out there over the weekend. Peggy Noonan last night, she's on Drudge's show. Peggy Noonan said by Friday, the liberals are going to be so frustrated at having to say this nice stuff that they're going to implode on themselves, and a never-ending stream of hatred and anger is going to come rolling out on the day of the funeral. They're just going to be unable to stop it because this is so against their natural tendency. They're not going to be able to fake it even a whole week. Here's Brenda in Effingham, Illinois. Welcome to the EIB Network. Great to have you with us, Brenda. Thanks for waiting.
Hi, Rush. It's such an honor to talk with you, especially on a day when you're paying tribute to Ronald Reagan. Look, Rush, I wanted to call and let you know that I was only 8 years old when Ronald Reagan was elected president. I was in the 3rd grade, and there was a mock election at our school. And President Reagan was my guy, and I was campaigning for him, and I wanted him to win. And he won at our school in a landslide victory, and he put a lot of enthusiasm into politics for me. I came from a household that was largely Democratic, and very strong Democrats there. And for some reason, Ronald Reagan's character really inspired me, and he had good moral fabric, good moral being to him. And I just thought he was an outstanding man. And to this day, I'm a strong conservative. And I want to honor President Reagan by voting pro-life this fall and voting to protect the sanctity of marriage this fall.
Well, thanks for the call. Appreciate it, Brenda. I think a lot of people probably like that who were affected at a young age in politics or by politics for the first time by Reagan. It was that powerful. You know, you can... I've done it myself. We spent a lot of time here going into detail about what it was about Reagan that reached us and touched us and what we thought made him great. One of the most frustrating things to me, and this is not a criticism because don't misunderstand this, but one of the most frustrating things over the weekend was all these videos, sound bites that they're playing of Reagan, but they're talking over them. And I wanted to hear what Reagan said. And sometimes we did. Sometimes they played some of the bites. Sometimes anchors talked over them. But regardless, the thing that stood, I never saw him not smiling. He was happy. He wasn't just smiling. He was just happy as he could be to be alive. And he just, you can get as detailed and as technical as you want, but you can boil it down to something very, very simple. He was a likable guy. You could not dislike him personally. He just, I don't know, is a rare individual. Most people do not have the natural abilities that Reagan did. And with him, they weren't abilities. It was just who he was. And he couldn't hide it if he'd wanted to. His first State of the Union speech in 1981, he's been in office, a couple days. And so he stands up, and he doesn't know he knows the State of the Union is bad, but it hadn't anything to do with it, fix it yet. So he stands up, and he starts out by quoting George Washington and how important it is never to forget George Washington, who he defined as the man without whom none of us would be here today as Americans and so forth. And he stops, and he was 69. They were already joking about his age then. He was an old fogey, a codger. He was out of it. And he said, now, I wasn't there personally to hear George Washington say this. And the whole House chamber erupted. Even Tip O'Neill sitting behind him erupted in laughter. But then he said, I know it's true because it's part of the historical record. And the reason he said that was they were already trying to say that Reagan was making things up and lying about things, and he was too old to know what he was talking about. So he was getting his little dig in with one of the little funny bit of humor. And it just disarms everybody. It just had that unique ability. In fact, there's a James Baker. Grab the audio soundbite here, Mike. Let me find. Let's see. Oh, yeah, this is a great story. This is going to run about a minute. This was Saturday. I was driving around in my new car. Went out for a spin. I don't want to say devastated. I was sad. I was just. So I had to get out of the house. I went out and I got my new car. My new car's got satellite radio in it. So I tuned in the Fox News channel and what? Which the new car, the one I've been telling everybody about, the one that goes 0 to 60 4.8 seconds. It weighs 6,200 pounds with a twin turbo V12. And so anyway, and James Baker is on, and he tells Britt Hume this story.
So we bring Bishop Tutu in. The press is in full cry. They're sitting in the wing chairs in front of the fireplace, and they start shouting questions at the president. What about this and that Bishop Tutu had said, criticizing your policy? And the president said, wait a minute, fellas. He says, this is a photo opportunity. I'm not going to take any questions. And so they turned to Tutu and started asking him questions, and he responded quite vigorously, trashing the president up one side and down the other. Then he went out on the White House driveway, and proceeded to trash him further. Boy, the next day the press couldn't wait. The first event in the Oval Office, whatever it was, and I can't remember, they go rushing in there and they say, Mr. President, what about Bishop Tutu? Bishop Tutu, what about Bishop Tutu? And the president's sitting there like this, and he looks down at his hands. He says, Bishop Tutu? He says, so-so. It totally disarmed him. How was your meeting with Bishop Tutu? Tutu? So-so.
Let me go to Jeannie in Elkhart, Indiana. Welcome to the EIB Network. Nice to have you with us.
Rush, it's a great pleasure to talk to you once again.
Thank you.
And thank you for honoring this great man. I have to tell you, Reagan was the ultimate statesman. He truly cared about the next generation and not the next election. And I really think he demonstrated that by his statesmanship, by the way he dealt with the Russians. For instance, Star Wars. I mean, that was a pretty bold initiative to address Star Wars. And I know you remember this. I think it was so great when he fired all the air traffic controllers. You remember that?
Yeah, I do.
I just thought that was a very bold move. But he was a man that stood by his principles, and he was the total opposite of what we know of political correctness today. And I think he truly inspired the American people by his vision for America. And I know he inspired me because in 1980, when he ran for office, he inspired me to get involved with a political campaign, and I did that, and I've been involved ever since then. And I think of you, too, because you inspire your listeners, and I just thank you for it. And if I could just say one other thing, you had asked earlier about how our greatness can be defined.
Yes.
If I could just make a comment about that, I think our greatness can be defined by our commitment and belief in God. And if we cease to believe in God and recognize Him, then we will cease to be a great nation. And Reagan recognized that. He saw that in the Russian people, the atheistic society, and he knew that they would not be a great nation because of their unbelief in God.
Well, let me play for you just how right you are, Jeannie. Grab audio soundbite number 18, Mr. Broadcast Engineer. I want you to listen to President Reagan, folks. This is about half a minute is all from his 1984 State of the Union address.
It's just the tendency of government to grow, for practices and programs to become the nearest thing to eternal life we'll ever see on this earth. And there's always that well-intentioned chorus of voices saying, with a little more power and a little more money, we could do so much for the people. For a time, we forgot the American dream isn't one of making government bigger. It's keeping faith with the mighty spirit of free people under God.
Conservatively speaking, Father's Day is June 20th. Find the perfect gift for Dad. Go to the EIB store at rushlimbaugh.com. You're listening to the EIB Network.
Our tribute to Ronald Reagan continues. Your phone calls will continue to be part of this. The telephone number, 800-282-2882, Rush Limbaugh. I was almost going to say El Rushbo there, but my brain ran faster than my syllables could keep up. Anyway, the number is 800-282-2882. You know, this is really not so much about Reagan, but it just helps me make a point that I've always made. And it's about Bill Clinton. I've told the story. In March of 2001, I attended a dinner in the White House President Bush was holding for some baseball people. Since I'm a baseball guy, I used to work for the Kansas City Royals, so I'm a powerful, influential member of the media, I was there. And after dinner, the president took everybody on a tour of the White House, other than the residence quarters, which I've also seen but did not make it up there this trip, but took us into a number of rooms where the press conferences are held, state dining room, some of the others, and then into the Oval Office and the cabinet room. And so we walked in the Oval Office, and the president posed with it. Joe Torre was there, had a box of baseballs, and the president was signing baseballs, and Cal Ripken was there, and George Will, and a number of Don Baylor, Tom Glavine, I could go on and on. General manager of the Oakland A's was there. Anyway, walked in the Oval Office, and the president had made a point to say that he had ripped up a carpet or a rug that Clinton had and put one that was there during the Reagan years. But everybody, we whispered it among ourselves, but it was never spoken really aloud. But everybody's, okay, where in here is the room was the Lewinsky room. It sort of upset me. Here we are in the Oval Office, and one of the first things we're all thinking about is that. I said, what kind of legacy is this? So I want you to listen to Cronkite. Walter Cronkite was on Larry King Alive. What was it? Saturday night. And it had Mike Wallace on there, and Howard Baker, and Bob Dole, George Will, Hugh Sidey of Time Magazine. And Cronkite had this to say about an interview that he did with Reagan.
It was a useless interview. He'd only been in office 2 or 3 months, and as a consequence, he didn't have anything to talk about. I don't think we even got on the air with the actual interview, but afterwards he's asked me to come back into his private office, the little office off the Oval Office. That was made famous by a later president, of course.
Well, that's what Cronkite's talking about here. Even Cronkite has to mention that he's been in the room where that all took place. And see, for whatever the Democrats today want to hope and dream for, whatever the Clintons today want to hope and dream for, this is what's going to be the legacy of the Clinton administration in the Oval Office. It's inescapable. It's just inescapable. James in Norfolk, Virginia, hi, and welcome to the EIB Network.
Hey, Rush. It's such an honor to speak with you today.
Thank you, sir.
I just wanted to tell you about my remembrance of Reagan. I was 7 years old at the time of the Challenger explosion, and I had lived in Houston at the time, and the elementary school I went to was named after Sally Ride, the astronaut who didn't go on the Challenger mission, but several of them had come and met with us and talked to us about what it was like to be in space for long periods of time. And I remember that day watching the liftoff and then the explosion in the sky. And after that, I don't remember so much of it. I don't remember what my teacher said or exactly what my parents said to comfort me that evening. But I do remember watching President Reagan speaking to the nation and comforting the people after the Challenger explosion. And I just remember his words, and they were so moving to me. And that was the first time that I really realized, all that the president meant to us and meant to me personally. And it really got me interested in politics, made me feel comfortable and safe. And the thing I remember most about President Reagan is that he inspired me to dream big dreams and to believe that anything was possible.
How old were you at this time? You say 7th or 8th grade?
I was 7.
7 years old, okay.
Yes, yeah, 7. And I was in the 2nd grade. And I just remember him, inspiring us, telling us that our greatest days were ahead. And ever since then, through everything else that's happened, I was living in Oklahoma at the time of the OKC bombing, and then with 9/11 and all of the threats that we potentially face today, that's never left me, and it will never leave me. Because if he were here today, he'd tell us, your greatest days are ahead, America. You have the ability and you have the challenge to face anything that you put your mind to, and you will. And so I just want to honor him today and let everyone know how much I love him and how much he touched my life and got me interested in politics.
Thank you for calling, James. Well said. Appreciate it. Here he is talking at age 7, back in the mid-'80s when the Challenger exploded, how Reagan affected him and so forth. I can go back, and I have it here. I go back, I can play you excerpts of Reagan's 1964 speech that he gave for Barry Goldwater on the eve of the election. And it would sound almost like Reagan sounded in the 80s, because that's who he was, sounded like that through his whole life. He never wavered. He didn't change. He used to be a Democrat but became a Republican, and did that because the Democratic Party moved away from him. And he was, you talk about commitment to core values and principles. I don't even think he had to think about it. He didn't, okay, it just was. And these calls, for all of you who spotted this and recognized this when you were 7, I mean, years and years and years before you were even a thought in your parents' dirty minds, Ronald Reagan was who he was. I'm just being funny with dirty. Don't take it personally. You are all legitimate. We'll be back here in just a second. Stay with us.
Mediocrity is not an option. Rush on the EIB network.
Now it's getting a little warm in here, folks. Got an hour to go. I'm going to lower the thermostat over there and kick it in, get ready to go for the next hour. Sit tight, it won't be long, and we will be right back here at the Limbaugh Institute for Advanced Conservative Studies. Folks, how are you? Welcome back. Rush Limbaugh here on the Excellence in Broadcasting Network on another great day in America. This is a tribute to Ronald Reagan we are engaging in today. We're very close. The transcript for the first hour of the program, requested by popular demand, is almost cleaned up and ready to be posted. I'll give you a clue as to when it's up. It'll be up at rushlimbaugh.com. Here's the phone number. If you would like to join us, 800-282-2882, and the email address is rush@eibnet.com. HR just had a question. Can you imagine the current events classes in the public school system today? Can you imagine? Can you imagine what some of these teachers are having the trouble that they were having answering questions from their students? Why is everybody doing this? What's so big? We don't know who this guy is, these little students are saying. And can you imagine what their teachers... I mean, I'm not going to put words in their mouths. Don't worry. But it's got to be a confounding thing for some of the teachers. At any rate, the funeral procession, not the funeral, but the casket, Ronald Reagan just now has arrived at his library in Simi Valley. There's an arrival ceremony. The body will then lie in state there for public viewing throughout the day. It'll be flown to Washington. This will be a full-fledged state funeral, something Reagan would be extremely honored by. They're closing the government on Friday on the day of his funeral. It's one of the greatest tributes and testaments to him. It's by no means the biggest one, but it's a nice touch. I think I heard the stock markets are also going to be closed on Friday as well. Lyndon Johnson did not get a state funeral. No, he didn't lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda, and they didn't have the procession. I mean, this is going to look like the Kennedy funeral, Mr. Snerdley. They're going to have the horse-drawn corsage. What am I thinking? It's not the caisson. And it'll be a lone drummer playing just as there was during that whole... I will never forget the Kennedy funeral. Black and white TV. And this will be in ceremonial characteristics. It'll be just like that. It'll be lying in state in the Capitol for a couple days. And then the burial will actually be at sunset, Simi Valley, on Friday. The family is now being escorted in the library. They'll have a private ceremony themselves for a half hour, and then the casket will be open for viewing there. So it's going to be a full week for the country and for the Reagan family. I got via email, Cookie up in New York sent me another Reagan letter that I had received in 1994. And there's I don't want to read the whole thing. We'd done a tribute to Reagan on his birthday on one of my TV shows, and this was a letter from him thanking us for it. And I had mentioned on the tribute, talked about all of the criticism he had gotten and all the attempts there were to rewrite the history of the Reagan presidency and of the 80s. How frustrated I was by it, but I was going to do whatever I could to see to it that the actual history survived and the rewrite and the revisionism didn't succeed. And there are two little paragraphs in this letter that I want to share with you because it again is illustrative of how Reagan lived and the optimism that he possessed, that was him. He said, unfortunately, today we can't escape the so-called experts who are busy chipping away at all we accomplished, not only our record, but also our convictions and even our integrity. Frankly, I've never been distracted by revisionist claims, Rush. I feel strongly that we should allow our record to stand the test of time. Let history decide. I know it'll judge us fairly. He wasn't worried. And he went on to say, I'm comforted to know that our country is in the capable hands of gifted young individuals like you and your listeners and viewers. You are the backbone of our great nation, solely responsible for the success of our worldwide cruise. Well, that was a little hyperbole there, solely responsible. But this is the second of two communications I'd received from President Reagan, who, again, I stress I've never met. But he said, God bless you and your audience for believing, for having faith in America's future, and for making a difference in this world. Keep up the good work. Sincerely, Ron. I have learned so much. I'm not even aware of how much I've learned from Ronald Reagan. And I think I'm aware of quite a bit. You remember, I think it was maybe last week or the week before, it was one of those days where the press was just relentless in tarring and feathering Bush. The prison scandal was raging. We were failing in Iraq. We were a horrible country. It was just, or you were all upset. And I was being deluged with phone calls and emails from people who you were almost at your wits' end. How can we can't win this election. We can't survive. There's too many America haters out there that are Americans. What are we going to do? Oh, woe is me, woe is us. And this was the theme of so many of these letters. And as I've always done in the midst of such things, I said, wait a minute, I have a totally different view of this. And my view of this is, my optimism is not false. And I'm not just trying to keep people pumped up. It's genuine. I said, I'm optimistic because we've got truth on our side. I'm optimistic because we're doing the right thing. And I made this point, and I made it twice, both in terms of just the history of the moment, but also it was a discussion about the media, because that's what so much of this negativism falls on, is the media. And of course, sitting in my chair, I'm not negative about the media at all. I get mad at what they do, but I'm not afraid of them anymore. And if you were sitting in my chair, you wouldn't either. Not only did I say, are there red and blue states that divide the people of this country, there's a red and blue media now. And I said, the history of what's happening here, the history of the moment, is being written by those who are losing this battle. So, of course, they're going to write critical things of those of us in the new media that are providing chinks in their armor. It's only to be expected. But this is not the ultimate history of what's happening. I really believe it is seminal what's happening to the media in this country. I think the so-called new media made up of the internet and talk radio and Fox News and all these the bloggers on the internet and the magazines and the newspapers that are becoming more and more conservative, combined with the dwindling viewership of the old standby networks, the dwindling circulation of the big newspapers. This is a seminal moment. It's the first time in American history where the media monopoly that lived for, in the modern era, in the last century, lived for practically 85 years of the last century. To be more precise, let's say 50 years of a media monopoly. It's actually longer than that, but We'll peg it at 50. And they saw no end in sight to it. Now they don't have it anymore. There are people who are not even born yet who are going to write the history of what's happening now, not just in the country, but what's happening here with what I consider to be a huge shakeup in media, a huge redefinition of media in this country. And it's important because media is the only business officially acknowledged in the Constitution, the press, and its freedom. No other business is so enumerated. So it has importance. It has importance to our representative republic. The Founding Fathers knew it. So people are going to write the history of what's happening years from now. They will not have been alive during this period. They're going to look back. They're going to look at the history written today by people who are losing. And then they're going to look at the results. They're going to look at the changing landscape. And the truth of this seminal moment here will eventually be written. The truth of World War II was eventually written. Remember last week on my website, we went back. We traced all the New York Times stories from 1945. Life magazine, 1946. Remember? It was stunning. Life magazine in October or December 1946. We couldn't keep the peace. We were going to lose. We couldn't keep what we had won. The Europeans hated us. It was almost identical to what we're reading now about the Iraqis and our inability to keep the peace and follow through with our victory there and make our objective work. The New York Times in 1945 had story after story after story. That was no different. That is no different from the stories they write today, other they were about France and Germany rather than Iraq. It was stunning. And yet we do know the truth of World War II, do we not? Yet that history, the accurate history, has been written. The people who were writing of it at the moment were wrong. The people in the midst of it, who were writing of it as it happened, were wrong. People who did not live through it or who were born after it got it right. Same thing's going to happen here. Now, the whole the whole point of me telling you this is that this was not something I was raised with, this realization. It's something that I think I intellectually came to myself, but I think that there's an association with my study and having been personally impacted by Ronald Reagan. The optimism, he's totally content. He was in 1994 totally content to let future historians write his record. It would survive. Let history decide. I know it will judge us fairly. Look what's happening this weekend. The most honest and the fairest assessment of the Reagan presidency is being reported. Now, there are people saying things they don't mean, but they are saying things that are true nevertheless. There are people saying things they wish they didn't have to say, but they are saying them nevertheless because they can't afford not to. Because if they remained who they are during this week, they would be finished and they would wipe John Kerry off the map and it wouldn't matter who their candidate was. But they cannot afford to be who they really are during this week, and that is the power of Ronald Reagan and his integrity and the truth of his presidency and his life. It cannot be rewritten, and it cannot be denied. If it can happen within days of his death, only, less than 20 years after he left office, imagine what history will judge, how history will judge Reagan on into the future. He was optimistic, and I am convinced that much of mine comes from being affected by Reagan. Not solely. I've got a number of personal experiences in my own life to be optimistic about, as we all do. We just have the courage to admit it. Sometimes it takes courage. Yeah, I ought to be feeling good things. I ought to be feeling good about this. Some people don't want to feel good because the negative overpowers, but we all have reasons to feel good and be feeling happy, while at the same time have concerns. And it is hoped that the optimism will override. It's hoped that the optimism will overpower the negative, for if it doesn't, the negative will win. That's not good. Anyway, brief timeout. We'll be back and continue with more of your phone calls on today's tribute to Ronald Reagan after this. There are cameras and microphones at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley for the family ceremony for the display of Ronald Reagan's casket. Right now, let me check something very, very quickly here. Just silence. Let's listen to the silence. Let's jib it and just listen for just a minute and see if something further happens. The minister has just concluded his remarks with the Lord's Prayer. Two rows of seats for the family. One member of each branch of the service standing at attention next to the casket. That's the sound of camera's shutters that you're hearing. Family's now rising. Let's bump out of this in case they're now rising. Nancy and the children rising to touch the casket, which is flag draped. Let me check something real quick here, folks. Still no words being said, just the sound of cameras and shutters being clicked. Nancy is kissing the casket as we speak. There's a brave woman. There's a really brave woman who has, those of you who've had Alzheimer's disease in your family know what it's like to deal with, and she dealt with it. So it's a touching, sad moment, but there still is no audio. The family is whispering to each other. There's really nothing to hear. I feel sort of like the invasion of a private moment, even though they've allowed it. While we wait, in case any other comments are made, which we will join if there are, I mentioned earlier that there's a story here that confirms Margaret Thatcher's version of how the Cold War came to end, and this story actually provides a lesson for us as we read the partisan mainstream media this week on Ronald Reagan. The lesson is how to read the partisan press, and that is to get to the truth of things, go to the end of the story, where the lead will be buried. This story is headlined Gorbachev-Reagan. When Ronald Reagan proclaimed the Soviet Union an evil empire, some saw it as political theater, a Cold Warrior's script. Yet former Soviet leader Gorbachev said Sunday the American president was sincere, an honest rival and friend. By the end of the superpower rivalry, the leaders had formed a partnership that steered their superpower nations away from the brink of nuclear war and toward the end of Moscow's empire. Gorbachev, who won the Nobel Prize for his work in reforming the Soviet Union and easing world tensions, nevertheless credited Reagan. This is just another illustration. Jimmy Carter wins a Nobel Prize. Gorbachev wins a Nobel Prize. Ronald Reagan never did. Here is, though, the end of the story. Gorbachev, meanwhile, was struggling to halt the Soviet Union's slow but relentless economic deterioration, trying to initiate a Soviet response to the U.S. Missile Shield program. SDI was a heavy burden on the Kremlin treasury, already strained by the inefficient and corrupt Soviet command economy. Gennady Gerasimov, the foreign ministry spokesman under Gorbachev, told the Associated Press that Star Wars was, quote, very successful blackmail. The Soviet economy could not endure such competition. The truth at the end of the story. It's an AP story by Jim Hines. Jim, not trying to ruin your career here by mentioning your name in a positive light, but this is precisely what Margaret Thatcher said in that lecture that I have referred to today on this program that I witnessed as a guest of Justice Kennedy's at the Waldorf Astoria in New York. She said it. Her own words were very plain. SDI told Gorbachev the final fact, the final truth. He knew the Americans could do it, and he knew his country couldn't. They simply had no economic way of competing. Now, Gennady Gerasimov here calls it blackmail, but the truth of the matter is it wasn't blackmail. It was a seriously intended program. And the critics back then, by the way, just to remind you, all said it'll never work. Every great idea greeted by the left is poo-pooed. It won't work. It can't work. And that, of course, was not Ronald Reagan. Anything worthwhile can work. And the reason it can work is because we are Americans. We have the freedom to do great things. Therefore, we have the ability and the means. The oppressed of the world simply can't compete. Quick timeout. We'll be back and continue. Don't go away.
Rush Limbaugh. And it's powerful stuff.
Here we are on the cutting edge of societal evolution from the Limbaugh Institute for Advanced Conservative Studies. I'm utilizing, as always, talent on loan from God. I am your host, the all-knowing, all-caring, all-sensing, all-feeling, all-concerned, all-everything Maharishi, also known as America's Truth Detector and the Doctor of Democracy. I have here another AP story. And I just can't let this stuff go. I mean, I've got to comment on some of this stuff because it's seductive. If you don't know how to read this stuff, you can be trapped. You can end up ensnared in something that is a bit of a misleading mirage, so to speak. This is Reagan Legacy, it's called. Ronald Reagan told Americans that government was the problem. They haven't been quite the same since. Lionized by his party, mimicked by opponents when not mocked by them, he spoke the verities of a new age of conservatism that remains the strongest thread in American politics. That's good. So far, so good, right? We're hooked. Wow. Haven't seen this in the mainstream press for a while. Let's continue. A gift and a burden came from the Reagan years. The gift is the landmark arms control agreements that brought the world steps back from nuclear Armageddon, combined with a toughness that his admirers say was the final thrust of Cold War victory. After his time, the Berlin Wall came down. Now, that was only one leg of the stool. There were three legs of the stool of Reaganism. One was beating back communism, another was rebuilding the U.S. military, and the third was tax cuts. And that's been the hardest one for even the Democrats praising Reagan over the weekend. They leave that one out. They just leave out tax cuts because to mention tax cuts equates Bush with Reagan. It makes Bush the Reagan heir. It takes the Reagan legacy straight to Bush. So they just try to leave the tax cuts out. We're not going to let them get away with that. And rebuilding the military, too. Now, of course, to the press, beating back Soviet Union is a big deal because they thought it would never happen. And at times, they thought Gorbachev was the savior of the world. That's why the Gorbasms on this program came into existence. The press actually thought Mikhail Gorbachev was the man who was going to save the world, that Reagan was going to start World War III. He was just a tricky, itchy-fingered cowboy that was going to push that button and launch Armageddon, which, of course, was never true. But here's what AP says is the burden of the Reagan years, a sensational cost of that toughness, and more. Reagan powered up the military while attacking the anti-poverty programs he said didn't work. His shining city was built on a mountain of debt. Reagan never attacked poverty. He didn't attack anti-poverty programs. This is the kind of thing that just makes me want to scream. The assumption is that everything about the Great Society was wonderful. And if you try to look at the Great Society and say, that didn't work and that didn't work, we need to replace it, get rid of it, or whatever, you were anti-poverty, you were anti-poor, you were anti-this and anti-that. And that just wasn't the case. The Great Society, the war on poverty, all these great things was a debacle. And you talk about costs, the costs of the Great Society. The working people of this country ended up transferring over the period of 30 years $5 to $7 trillion to people who wouldn't or couldn't, and it didn't matter. It didn't matter. All the percentages all stayed the same. You know what finally mattered? What finally made an impact didn't happen until the late 90s, and that's welfare reform. And guess where that got started? It got started with what's called today an attack on anti-poverty programs. It never was an attack on anti-poverty programs because, you know how Reagan conservatism defines compassion? You define compassion by not counting the number of people who receive benefits. You define compassion by counting the number of people who no longer need them. And that was the objective all along. They still can't resist getting a little dig in here that Reagan was cold-hearted and mean-spirited to the poor. Welfare reform, entitlement reform, tax cuts, a balanced budget, a crime crackdown featuring support, even eagerness for the death penalty, a rallying against family breakdown. Both parties wanted to do those things after Reagan took a crack at them. They did? Both parties wanted to take a crack at these things? If that's the case, we wouldn't be as divided as we are. Both parties my rear end. Yeah, this is history revisionism here. Welfare reform, you can't. Everybody wants to give Clinton credit for it because he signed the bill, but he vetoed it twice. Tried to do everything he could to stop it. Entitlement reform, we don't have entitlement reform. Wish we did. Tax cuts, tell me a Democrat other than Zell Miller who supports them. Tell me. I mean, true, Bill Richardson. Governor of New Mexico, cut taxes in his state. But aside from that, you can't name me any Democrats who want to do tax cuts because they saw Reagan do them. We have Democrats who tried to revise what happened in the 80s and blame the tax cuts for all of our misery. To this day, they blame Bush's tax cuts for whatever misery they're trying to convince you exists. Of course, we're in another one of those economic booms that looks like it may rival the one Reagan created in the 1980s. And it's only going to continue to grow. There's a story in the paper today that by the election, there may be a net gain of 750,000 jobs in this country. Net gain after all this talk about Reagan lost. What is it? 2 million jobs lost on Bush's watch? Oh, yeah, that's right. It went up to 3. The Democrats said 3 million jobs lost and so forth. Well, it was really, the figure was never that high, but the new number is a net gain of 750,000 may occur by the election. So you have to know how to read this stuff, folks, very, very, very carefully. You know, and the New York Times piece today, Reagan legacy looming large over campaign. They are just as Adam Nagurney, and they are petrified that this whole week is something Kerry won't recover from. They are petrified that Bush is going to try to associate himself with this, and they're already editorializing how unseemly it would be for a sitting president to try to tie himself to the death legacy of a president who has just passed away and so forth. And, of course, the answer to that is he doesn't have to. Doesn't have to try. If there's anybody out there on the political stage that has inherited the Reagan legacy, it is Bush. Primarily with tax cuts and his vision for the world and America. There's no way John Kerry can claim it, and no way a Democrat can claim it, and so they don't want Bush to claim it. It would be unseemly. But he does. Yeah. Who? Clinton? The Nixon funeral. Yeah. Well, that's true. The Nixon funeral, but that's. I have a totally unique recollection of the Nixon funeral. Let's talk about it just the Nixon funeral. I'll never forget that. The whole ceremony took place in the Nixon Library in that little house. Remember that little house he grew up in? Here's a man who reached the pinnacle of American success in political life. That little house that he grew up it was in the picture throughout the funeral. I just couldn't get over it. That. You know, something about Nixon, his wife, Pat, he loved her so much. When she had dates with other guys, he offered to drive them just so she could be near. He could be near. Just loved her so much. Anyway, yeah, Nixon, the funeral, Clinton was praised for being a great statesman and flew everybody out there on Air Force One and televised the landing of Air Force One, much like I was televised landing in Philadelphia during McNabb week. But what strikes me about the Nixon funeral was Jimmy Carter and Rosalynn sitting there. I will never forget this, because to the people on the left, and a lot of it, Richard Nixon was just yick. You know, it just didn't like Nixon. And here all these people were standing up praising Nixon. Henry Kissinger stood up there. Bob Dole got up there. All kinds of people. Reagan was there, but he didn't speak. Reagan and Nancy were there, but he didn't speak. But just person after person strode to the podium and praised Nixon when it came to foreign policy. And I could just see Rosalynn jabbing Jimmy in the ribs, saying, "You believe this? This guy, Richard Nixon? And he's getting all this praise, and look at you, Dumbo." And from that point, the quest for the Jimmy Carter Nobel Prize began. I am convinced of it. I am totally convinced of it. Because I think he's sitting there, total disbelief that Nixon could have all these accolades at his funeral. Anyway, let's take a quick time out. We'll come back and get back to your phone calls right after this, my good friends. Sit tight, won't be long.
This Father's Day, thrill your dad with his own membership to Rush 24/7. Complete election news and analysis, plus round-the-clock access to El Rush Bowl and a free bonus gift available only at RushLimbaugh.com. You're listening to the EIB Network.